Let's break the political talk show mold. Anything worth doing is hard, and that includes being a good citizen. Our mission is to help you be that better citizen by letting you hear about stuff you might not know, which will make everyone think you're so smart, or by giving you a chance to listen to interviews and debates on a wide variety of subjects that might actually allow you to form new opinions in the privacy of your own mind. I'm Justin Oldham, and you are listening to the Politics and Patriotism Show here on the Stitcher Smart Radio Network. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to another civic edition of the Politics and Patriotism Show. Today I'd like to bring you a conversation with Joe Costello, who's trying to ignite a new social movement here in the United States. What he's actually trying to do is reinitiate some of what we used to call in the old days political discourse. Now, if you go to his website, which is ofbyforbook.com, you'll find that he's got some rather extensive forums set up to spark people's interest in political discussion. And don't let this fool you. This is not the same old partisan stuff. Now, Joe is on the other side of the political spectrum from where I sit, but we both want the same thing. One of the reasons why I and my fellow contributors started this show back in January of 2011 was to bring you food for thought so you'd have something to talk to amongst yourself and your friends, and you'd be able to actually initiate your own political dialogue. Make up your own mind. Well, this is part of what Joe is trying to achieve. Now, he's got some other social goals in mind. He's got his own thoughts about where we stand in regards to fossil fuels and recycling and other stuff like that. And that's up for debate. But that's for you to decide. And so I'd like to bring you this conversation that I had with him in its full Technicolor widescreen detail. So please go to www.ofbyforbook.com so that you can look at his website while you're following along with this discussion.
Joe Costello, and I've been involved or following American politics for 3 decades. I started out when I was 19 years old, and I went to work for Teddy Kennedy's campaign against Jimmy Carter in 1980 for the Democratic nomination, and spent 9 months, dropped out of school, and learned a lot. And then went on and ran campaigns pretty much for the next dozen years, everything from city council to congressional races to state senate races, mayor's races, all up and down the board. And then in '92, I was communications director for Jerry Brown, who's now governor of California's campaign for the Democratic nomination. And we had a message to people that the political system was getting more and more corrupt and more dysfunctional, that money was flooding the whole system and, really kind of making a mockery out of our democracy, and that if people did not do something about it, it was only going to get worse. And so now here we are 20 years later, and it has gotten worse. After that campaign, I got out of politics, worked on energy, renewable energy issues, did a bunch of stuff on the internet, and then went back in again one more time for 2004 as a senior advisor for Howard Deaton's campaign, because I was really concerned that we were really going downhill much faster. And then since then, I've been more and more concerned about how we actually get a movement going to reform our politics and our government. And the foundation of that reform is what does democracy look like in the 21st century?
We're talking about your new book, which is Of, By, For, The Politics of Money, Debt, and Democracy. And I'd like to point out that you started your political activities long before there was an internet, long before there were super PACs. And so when you're talking about the trend that would see money dominate politics. You're talking about something that goes way back. This is not a new phenomenon. This is something that's been with us for quite some time.
Yeah, that is correct. And I mean, our politics have changed over time, and so we haven't done a really good job of keeping up with the times with our all sorts of our both our politics and our government systems. But money has just been really, started flowing into the process. It's always been part of the process, but it became the most essential element, in the 80s, really when it really started going down. But part of that was because it became more and more important was because kind of the checks and balances of like old institutions and associations, like labor and local political organizations and the Lions Club and things like this. All these things had some sort of political association, and they all got basically kind of fell by the wayside over time. And politics got taken over simply by money, polls, which is really kind of a professional class of political people, and television. And that's where we are. And that television was dominated by 30-second commercials, and that's not a very good way to have a democratic conversation.
No, it's not really at all, and that's my opinion, and I'm not afraid to admit it. I agree with you entirely. Now, we talk about these kind of things all the time here on the Politics and Patriotism show, and it's not enough to just whine about it. You, in this book, are proposing a number of solutions, and love them or hate them, that's one of the things we don't hear very much about these days, are the potential solutions. So why don't you take a few minutes here and wax eloquent for us on what you think we need to do for starters to pave the way for real solutions?
Okay. I mean, first of all, we have to kind of think about them. And, the problem is that our politics is just, very much a very small spectrum of the world, but it's controlled by very large forces and very entrenched interests. So to try to get something new through there, and even try to think about new things, is a very difficult process. And the first step in all this is really people getting back in, because nothing's going to be done unless the American people demand that it gets done. And in order for them to do that, they have to organize. And the first steps to organization are really very simple and deceptively simple, one might say. And the first step is education, and the second step is conversation. And really, conversation is what democracy is all about, and it's how everything works. And we don't have a political conversation in this country. But, then some of the issues that we need to talk about are, for example, like banking. And no one understands how the banking system works. And if no one understands how the banking system works, we're not going to get banking reform. That's just simple. Energy is another one, particularly oil. We're very dependent on outside the country for our oil. Almost half of it, and it was half, but we had a little bit of a blip because some of the shales come in for a little bit. But that's no solution, because it's not going to be a large and long-term amount of oil to replace, say, from the Gulf or from Mexico, or and instead of 30 years ago, when we learned that oil was a limited global resource, instead of getting our economy off oil, we spent a lot of money on the military trying to secure the remaining supplies around the Persian Gulf. And that's proved, I don't have to go into detail about how kind of problematic and disastrous that's proved. So, you say banking, and I would say banking and, oil particularly, but energy in a larger sense too. And then, the corporations. And corporations were basically, the modern corporation was basically birthed at the same time as this republic, back in around the end of the 18th century. And, there's been a battle between our institutions of government and corporations almost from the get-go and how that would work out. And, by the end of the 20th century, it became pretty clear that the corporations had become the dominant animal. And if the corporations are dominant in how we decide a lot of things in our society, that means we don't have self-government. It's just that simple. And what we need to do is we need corporate reform. And a very American and old solution to large corporate power is to break up that corporate power. And, we had a recent example of that and how effective that proved when we broke up the old phone company 30 years ago, AT&T. And look at what's happened with that. All the innovation, the internet, if old Ma Bell was still running the phone company, we'd be spending $5 to send an email across town. and so that was all allowed to happen because we released that control. And that's what we have to do. Democratic reform, in many ways, is about, breaking up established power and redistributing that so that it can form new ways of doing things.
Okay, let's start with the beginning of the list, education. Now, specifically, what do you mean by education in this case? Are you talking about the way we teach our children about politics and the way the world works, or are you talking about reforms to the education system in general?
Both that and, maybe like a new process, like what you're doing. What you do is education. And for us to appreciate this more, for us to appreciate that, we have to, all the people who are, over 22, 23 graduated from college, or 18 and never went to college, or even, people who dropped out of high school, that doesn't stop us from having, to learn anything anymore. We have to keep learning. And what we have to do is we have to teach each other about how these systems work. And there's plenty of information out there how the banking system works. You can read Bill Greider's Secrets of the Temple. It's just an excellent history of American banking. And you can learn about how this system works because we don't know how that works. So I'm saying, education reform and what education, say, of traditional education of what we consider, schooling, that's an issue, and we need to talk about that. But the more important is what we need is, small d democratic education amongst ourselves, where we talk to each other and we learn. And then when we learn some of these things, then we need to talk to each other about it, and that also will help us learn. But, this is politics at a very, and especially small d democratic politics at a very fundamental level, right? And that's missing from our country. You don't get any education from a 30-second ad, which is mostly about character assassination at this point, and not that a lot of these guys don't deserve it, but it doesn't help anything, and that we have to change that.
Well, I certainly appreciate your compliment, and I'm glad that you realize that primarily our mission here at the Politics and Patriotism Show is to bring people food for thought and to let them make up their own minds. And I would like to take a moment here to point out that the publishing process for your book was something that you initiated, and by virtue of the fact that you wrote this book and you've brought it out into the marketplace of ideas, that you are engaging in the same type of educational food for thought process that I am, and because of the digital revolution, which I am a big fan of, I always tell people if you have a new idea or if you have some twist on an old idea, then write the book and get it published, because we're fast approaching the point where publishing won't be free, but it'll be so cheap that you can, 20 years from now, you're going to go through the cushions in your couch to come up with some pocket change because you have an idea for a new book. And by taking it out into the marketplace and talking to the grassroots media as you get the opportunity to, you might really start something.
Yeah, I agree 100%, and you hit the nail on the head of my thinking and why I did this. Because a lot of the channels that are kind of traditional are, again, they're channels of very entrenched interest, and it's very hard to get kind of new ideas out there. And, and like you said, the internet, the digital revolution, this whole information era, whatever you want to call it, that we're kind of part of, this is going to allow these kind of things, and people need to take advantage of it. And 20 years ago, when the net first started getting a little bit of popular recognition, there was some thought about how this was going to be a really democratic, could be a really democratic medium to do things. And so I'm trying to take full advantage of that, and I urge everyone else to do the same. And again, I want to say, the first step again for organizing is education, and then the second step is that we start to talk to each other, and that's really important because we really don't know how to talk to each other about politics. Saying you're liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican doesn't really say very much about anything at this point, right? But that's our whole 90% of our political debate, such that it is comprised of those words.
Very true. Now, I would like to point our listeners to your website, which is ofbyforbook.com, and they can sign in and they can discuss things in your forums, which are rather extensive at this point.
Yes, please drop by, and I'm going around the country doing book tours, and my email is up there. It's joe@ofbyforbook.com, and I'd be happy to do a book party or just get together and talk to folks about some of these issues. And the whole reason, like you said, I put this book out was first to educate, and then secondly to start this conversation. And then the third thing is, what are we going to do? That's the last step of organization. How are we going to organize together to do something? And that's what I want to be out talking about.
This program is brought to you by ShadowFusionBooks.com.
Okay, now let's talk about what actually to do, and the politics of the thing. We could talk about that all day, and we're not going to make anybody happy. So let's skip ahead to the corporate part of this. What mechanisms are necessary to put corporations back on the chain? Now, I'm 47, and I can remember once upon a time when we were taught in grade school how government works. And now today, when I put on my coat and tie and walk into my neighborhood high school as the famous author, there are no civics classes anymore, and I end up having to spend half of my question and answer period just explaining on the dry erase board, this is how your government works. And I'm totally amazed at how much people are seeing and hearing for the first time. So with that in mind, how do we put these corporations back on their leash?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to do that, right? And like I said, a lot of this stuff you kind of have a larger, say, vision or view of where you want to go. And I think the biggest thing to understand about that is to have, that we've got to break up these corporations. And like I said, this was part of the populist era and the progressive era. Antitrust was once a big thing. And really what happened was the New Deal kind of made a pact with the devil, maybe, with the corporations, and said they wouldn't pursue antitrust, but they would regulate. And and the problem with that is that over time, the regulators get co-opted by the corporate power, and the corporations then take over and start regulating everything. So you need to break that up, and part of corporate reform is government reform. And now for people, what people need to do is a couple things. One is to understand that whenever they're making a purchase, they're voting. They're voting with their dollars, and that's one of the problems, like with our system today, is that so much has been given, decision making has given to the market that, and $1, one vote isn't the same as one person, one vote, right? Because a lot of people have a lot more dollars than other people, so they're outweighing your vote. But that nonetheless, if you start thinking hard about how you're doing things, like, for example, you can move your money out of the big banks, the 5 big banks. Move your money and go to a local credit union or a local bank and put your money in there. And then organize with your friends and neighbors for any kind of, things that you belong with, and especially like for your local government. Local governments, county governments, they all do a lot of business with the big banks and say, we don't want to do business with you anymore. We are going to do business through the local bank and, and get them. And there you have the power of the vote. And that's where I would say the key is to really kind of revitalizing our politics is first steps is through local government. And like you said, nobody knows how this process works, right? And even in where our presidential elections, where we have a 50% turnout, which means 50% of the people aren't even involved in doing that every 4 years, local elections turnout is now in the single digits. And that's just atrocious. No one knows who their city council person is or their county board supervisor or, various other local entities. And people have to learn about that because these institutions have very big power. And they have taxing power. They can do bonds. So there's a lot of things they can do. And a lot of things that we need to do to reform our economy, say for like example, energy, making, how we use less oil, that also is going to be primarily a responsibility of the local level. And so what we need to do is, start getting together and talking about what we can do and understand that the American system, as it doesn't function too well right now, and D.C. may be a very, very corrupt place, which it is. At the local level, it's still intact, and there's still a lot of ability to do things. So if you start there, and then you realize what you want, then you can start asking what maybe at the state level and at the federal level, what they could do to help you. And, you can go and say, why are we subsidizing oil use when we're trying to use less of it? Why are we bailing out the big banks when all they're doing is taking money from us every chance they get? And once people start organizing and start talking to each other and going into the, these local old institutions of power like their cities and their counties, they're going to find the connection that all around the country they're fighting, the same dozen large forces.
Okay, now, since we're on the subject of local politics, I would like to ask you to get very basic here for a moment. Let's say we have somebody in our audience who's entertaining the notion of running for local office. Now, I myself, I've got politics in my blood, and I've got a diploma here on my wall that says I have a degree in political science. And I understand that the first thing you have to do is essentially know your enemy, and that means getting educated before you enter the process. So, for the average layperson out there who's thinking about going into politics, what steps do you recommend they take to self-educate before they ever go down to the county registrar's office to file for that election?
Well, where to start? The first thing I would say is, what are the issues that you're most concerned about? And then find out some of those things. Maybe you got an underwater mortgage. Okay, 25% of the people who have mortgages in this country are underwater. And so we've given trillions of dollars to the banks, literally, and we've given no mortgage relief to all these people who, through no fault of their own, are now sitting, in their homes, and it's worth it's worth less than what they owe to the bank. Something should be done about that. So, they can learn about that, and then they can go talk to others, because if the whole thing about running for office is that you're going to have to talk to others, and you're going to have to get a whole lot of people voting for you. So before you run, you can go and just start talking to people and set up some meetings. Set up some meetings around your town. Set up some meetings around your neighborhood. Set up some meetings at your, your work, your schools, wherever you're at. But again, this sounds deceptively simple, but it's really not, because that is the whole process of politics, is talking to each other. And so then you can start talking to each other, and you'll find out, one of the interesting things you'll find out if you really kind of talk to people is a lot of people know various things about, various things. and so because everybody kind of educates themselves on what their interest is. So, when you bring that together, then you will have a force that will be able to take these things on. And don't think that it's just going to be you, and because that's the, united we stand divided, we fall, right? What you have to do is unite, and you have to bring people together. And to do that, you have to start talking. So I would say, start talking first, and then you can learn also how the process of politics works. You can learn, you can go to your local county registrar or to your city, and you can find out what the requirements are to run for office. And, one of the things I would like to do is just kind of goes on is provide, this stuff on the internet, and we can network together and we can talk and have people available for people to ask questions about how they do these kind of things. But again, the first step that we've got to get going is to start talking to each other.
Okay, now, unfortunately, money does come into the equation. So, sticking with our local scenario here, what advice would you have for the new first-time politician who's looking at raising money? And I'll just use an example. Here where I live in Anchorage, Alaska, it will cost you about $10,000 to run for a city assembly seat, and that's getting TV time, airtime, and some local media, which is basically nothing more than brochures. That does not account for canvassers or anything else. If you don't do these things, then nobody knows you exist. So you have to have at least the minimum buy-ins here. So what are what are the pitfalls that people need to look out for when they're doing this for the first time?
The biggest pitfall is not to do the groundwork first, and to go and say, what I'm going to do is run for office. And that's the first thing you think of. And that's what I'm saying. That's where you'll run into problems. Because what you need to create is this organization that is going to help you, that is going to fund you, and it is going to provide the ground soldiers, right? And the second pitfall to go into is then when you're running for office and thinking about it, is running for office how it's currently done. And that means, raising a bunch of money and putting it on TV. And again, what you're creating by talking to each other, what you want to do is you want to start creating alternative networks where people get their information and good information. Basically what the net, and you touched on it, what the net's kind of allowing is a reforming of kind of these information institutions, from newspapers to television stations and things like that, and start putting it together so that you can that you're talking to each other and it's on specific issues that people are educating on. And by creating that network of communication, then you're starting to create a network that can start electing people. And so that would be my sense, is start talking to people first and talking about these issues. And then when you started creating this network, then you can start talking about how you start going into the electoral process, and that's the most important thing. And that if you start off first going and saying we're going to run, you're kind of putting the cart before the horse a little bit.
Sounds good. Now, speaking of doing things, as we come into the final few minutes of the show, what else are you up to these days, and where can we find these things? Do you have other books? Do you have other websites?
No, it's all right there, because what I'm doing right now is this, and this is kind of, I've put aside everything else I've been doing and just focusing on this. And part of what I wrote this all for is to, is to be able to give because if you write a book, then you have a reason people will talk to you, which is an interesting thing. Because again, like this talking process sometimes is a little more difficult than people think it is. But and that's what you have to do. You have to have a reason, and those are issues. So what I'm doing, and you can go to the ofby4book.com website, and that's where I'll be posting more and more on there. This whole thing has just gotten released in the last couple of weeks. It's from the ground up enterprise, and so you can watch what's going on there, and and maybe come up with some ideas. And if I can be of any assistance in helping people, I will do that too. This is really just trying to get this thing going and off the ground, and hopefully, maybe it'll be a spark that will at least get some things moving everywhere, because that's what needs to happen.
It's my sincere hope that you were inspired or otherwise somehow educated by listening to this interview. The bottom line here is that activism is not a dirty word, and just trying to motivate people to do their own homework and think is not a waste of time. As we say so many times here on the Politics and Patriotism show, knowing is just half the battle. Before you can really make up your mind about an issue, you have to know about the nuts and bolts of the thing. And sometimes the only way to settle the hash of the thing, the only way to solve the problem, is to actually get your hands dirty with the politics of it. That's why we include the word politics in the title of the show. It's not enough to love your country. Sometimes you have to get involved in the running of your country in order to make the most of your own gifts, because, hey, sometimes you're the subject matter expert. Sometimes you're the man or the woman who has been doing something for so long that you have all the institutional knowledge. So thank you very much for your time, and on behalf of everyone here at the show, please have a good day.